Hey guys, good to be together. So the question has been given to us, and I'll quote it. How should we identify and develop biblically qualified, competent leaders in the churches we plant on the mission field? What has been your approach or method to select and prepare teaching elders or pastor teachers for the churches in your ministries? I took part in 2010 in the Lausanne Missions and Evangelism Leadership Task Force. So I was a part of the Leadership Task Force for the Lausanne Congress. It was held in Cape Town, South Africa. 5,000 people came together to think about missions and evangelism. Now, I don't usually agree to do such things, but in this case, it was very compelling. First, the group was this fantastic gathering of recognized leaders worldwide. They were men and women who were active and involved in heads of mission agencies, who directed leadership development ministries and other things like that. So that was compelling. Secondly, Doug Birdsall, the director of the Lausanne Committee, sort of twisted my arm with an appeal to my sinful pride. You've had so much leadership success, he said. But the most compelling thing to me was the question that the committee was asking about leadership. Why do churches around the world default to leadership models that are their cultural models of leadership rather than the model of leadership in the Bible? Biblical leadership is relatively easy to figure out. Jesus said, I came not to be served, but to serve. He said, no servant is above his master. Therefore, our model of leadership is servant leaders. This is something we can teach in a matter of minutes, seconds, really. Furthermore, Paul outlines clear instructions about churches' leadership in 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1, and 1 Peter 5. These have all been referenced. Now, Don Carson is the one who comments that the notable thing about these lists of qualifications for elders is that it's not very notable. That is, it's a list of things that should mark ordinary Christians who desire to follow Jesus under his lordship. And the one exception has been the elders must be able to teach. Now, again, these are not complicated concepts. The point is, it's not a problem of biblical literacy in general. So the question remains, why do churches default to cultural understandings of leadership when the teachings of leadership are clear? And so the leader of our task force asked this question and outlined the problem for us. He was a non-Westerner, and he asked these questions. Why do people in Africa have models of their church and the models of their pastor or elders as chieftains? Why is it the people of Asia have a model of a guru? Latin America has a charismatic dictator who can't be removed except by a coup. And those in the Middle East have a pastor that's a strong man with a family business. And in Europe, well, they just have bureaucrats, so they don't have leaders. And America has CEOs. Why is this? Now, of course, there are exceptions. But why is cultural leadership the default the world around? There are three main reasons, in my mind, why cultural leadership is the default method over biblical leadership. Number one, it's the path of least resistance. It's comfortable for congregations and pastors alike. It's the sea in which we swim. Secondly, it works, at least for a time. Consequently, it's unchallenged. I mean, who can argue with success, right? It can be very pragmatic and efficient, and the prevailing culture will affirm it. But of course, in the end, you lose God's intent for the witness of a church to the world. You lose the biblical narrative. And thirdly, models for a healthy church on the field, almost by definition, are non-existent on the field. The way of biblical leadership is an uphill countercultural slog involving patient teaching and careful living. So, how to respond to the problems is critical for the mission world today, and I have 3 responses. This is the outline for the talk. Number 1, the development of good leadership on the field starts at home. That is, we need churches and missionaries to understand the missionary job description clearly, to be prepared for that task. Secondly, the context for leadership and leadership development is the church the missionary plants. And thirdly, good leadership on the field springs from right teaching and life-on-life modeling. Good leadership, in other words, is both taught and caught. So point 1, understanding the missionary job description, developing good leaders starts at home. So to identify and develop biblically qualified, competent leaders on the mission field, we must know what we're aiming for. So before the missionary ever steps off a plane, they must understand the job description. If we get this wrong, brothers and sisters, we spin out of orbit. This is critical in general and specifically to leadership development. We start here because if we don't know the task, we'll not hit the marker. In other words, aim at nothing and you're sure to hit it. Furthermore, we must never assume that we're talking about the same thing. One of the great problems in missions is that we use the same words but have different meanings. So we need biblical words, we need biblical understandings and a solid foundation to help us speak the same language. Now, of course, mission springs from the heart of God to reach a lost world with the good news of salvation by faith for all peoples. We see his missionary heart woven throughout the Bible, starting in the first chapters of Genesis and continuing to the book of Revelation. But even with a Missio Dei foundation, that's sort of a fancy way to say God's missionary heart revealed through the Bible, it's doubtful that the church would have a full-orbed understanding of missions without the Great Commission. The Great Commission is the underlying foundation for missions. The Great Commission forms the missionary job description, and here it is. I want to read it to you. Matthew 28:16 through 20. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. So let me state some things that are obvious. I think you would know these things, but obviously Jesus is speaking to disciples in verse 16. A missionary must be a faithful follower of Jesus. Now, obviously, this is so important. And yet, time and again on the mission field, I've met people who call themselves missionaries, but as I watch their lives over time, they neither know the gospel or, in cases, don't know the Lord. They call themselves missionaries, but they're not Christians. Critical. Jesus is speaking to disciples. We see that Jesus sandwiches his commission between an assurance of his authority in verse 18 and the promise to be with him in verse 20. So we go with Christ's authority and under his protection. And he sends them to the nations, which is what most people, of course, think about when they think of missions. But then we come to the part of the Great Commission with a particular bearing on leadership, and it's this command to make disciples. To make disciples, Jesus requires 2 things: evangelism and teaching. So, evangelism. Missionaries go to the nations and become cross-cultural experts. But hear me on this. Going is not the end of missions. It's only the start. Missions is not primarily about a sacrificial life or language learning or getting visas or cross-cultural sensitivity or contextualization or living with the people or telling people not to distribute their prayer letters or alleviating suffering or eating exotic food. As good and vital as some of those things may be, it's not the primary goal. That's because you could do all that stuff and never share the gospel. Sadly, many missionaries are cultural experts but don't or won't share their faith. Gospel proclamation is primary. And let me put it plainly. If you never share the gospel, you are not a missionary. So first, missionaries must evangelize. This is the start of making disciples. Let me give you the Mack Stiles definition of evangelism. You ready? Evangelism is preaching or teaching the gospel with the aim to convert or persuade. That's the language Paul uses in Corinthians 5:11. So, the missionary knows how to overcome objections to the gospel, answer questions about the gospel, call people to respond to the gospel. Now, I know this sounds obvious, but I say it because many who call themselves missionaries have forgotten this or never knew it. You may do many other things on the mission field, such as mercy ministries, but if you do not do evangelism while working at a hospital or distributing aid or digging wells, you are not fulfilling the work of a missionary. Furthermore, all missionaries must know what the gospel is not. There must be no confusion between the gospel and gospel implications. Working to alleviate hunger is an implication of the gospel, and the missionary must explain to the watching world how what they are doing is fruit of the gospel that grows out of the gospel, but not the gospel itself. So the bottom line, the missionary must be able to distinguish between the gospel and how it applies to all of life. Now, as critical as evangelism is, there's more. We must teach. The second part of making disciples is teaching those the Lord adds to the church's number. So just as some missionaries forego evangelism, some missionaries may work hard to learn the culture but don't know how to disciple a younger believer. Or they may live with the people but never invite them to a gathering of believers. Jesus is specific in the Great Commission, both how we teach and what we teach. The how is to teach believers to obey Jesus' teaching. That is, we are not transferring cold data. We're calling people to follow Jesus as Lord. And what we teach is everything Jesus taught. Teaching everything is a big task. It takes time and effort. As Paul outlines in 1 Corinthians 3-4, this work is like building a house, not setting up a tent. The task is irreducibly complex. Now, some missionaries, I actually heard some missionaries say this. Some missionaries say we should give new believers a Bible and let them sort out church and the Christian life in their context. There are well-intentioned reasons for this, but ultimately it's the dereliction of a missionary's duty. We don't raise our children that way. We don't raise new believers without helping them grow, according to Galatians 4:19. So we teach, we explain, we answer questions, we live with them to model discipleship, we establish leadership, we write them once they're gone, we go visit them once we're gone. This is all a part of what Jesus means when he calls his disciples to make disciples. And when Paul speaks to the Ephesian elders in Acts 20-20-27, we've all referred to this so far, he repeats twice that he never shrunk back from teaching the whole counsel of God. In effect, Paul is recasting the need to apply the words of Jesus in the Great Commission to teach everything Christ taught. So notice, too, that as Paul recounts his missionary work in Acts 20, he speaks both to evangelism and to teaching. So missionaries make disciples through evangelism and by teaching new believers to obey all that Jesus taught. You need to nail that down. If you're going to support missions, if you're going to support missionaries, if you're going to be a missionary, if you are a missionary, those things need to be locked down in your hearts and mind. Secondly, the context for leadership and leadership development is in the church that the missionary plants. Now, if the missionary does not know the clear biblical principles and clear biblical instructions for church and church leadership, at the very start, the church we plant and the leaders we develop face clear negative consequences outlined by Paul in 1 Corinthians 3 and 4. Where the missionary is built with wood, hay, and stubble, it'll burn up. and they'll smell like smoke when they go to heaven, right? So missionaries must know how to plant churches. Let me be clear. The aim of all missionaries is to plant churches. This is the most needed part of our statement, I think, about leadership development. A church is the context in which disciples develop as leaders and the place where leadership is exercised. Yet planting healthy indigenous churches on the field, and I'm speaking in a broad sense as I survey the missions world in the world, is modern missions' weakest link. So let me expand on the idea that the aim of all missionaries should be planting healthy indigenous churches. Now, when I say indigenous, I mean a local church whose majority language, membership, and leadership are native to that place. And when I say healthy church, I mean it in a technical sense. Now, I love the IMB's foundation statement. I think it's a wonderful document. It's a local church shaped by biblical principles of expositional preaching, gospel doctrine, biblical conversion, biblical evangelism, membership, church discipline, discipleship, leadership, prayer, and missions. It's those things. No church, of course, is perfect. No church does all those things well all the time. Yet churches grow in health as they align themselves with these biblical principles. They become mature over time. The measurement of church health is maturity in Christ and a witness to the world, according to Ephesians 3:10 and 4:11 through 16. Healthy church is not a method, but simply a focus on those things the Bible outlines are principles for the church. Healthy church is an essential goal in mission work because a healthy local church is both the context and the consequence of disciples obeying all that Jesus commanded us, including the development of leaders. So all missionaries should belong to healthy or growing indigenous churches, or at least hold membership in church alongside the leaders they're developing. Now, when I say, by the way, I have a great story about membership that I'd love for someone to ask, but I don't have enough time to tell you. When I say the aim of all missionaries is to plant churches, it does not mean you can't do other things on the mission field. Of course you can. Missionaries can be doctors, they can be teachers, agricultural engineers, and more. However, any missionary not directly involved in church planting must show how their work and life on the field fosters church planting. So let me say that it's even more important, in one sense, for those missionaries to be members and leaders in a church, if they can be. And that's because the end goal of missions for any missionary is a healthy indigenous church. More on that later, but first let me explain how we get church planting just from the Great Commission. It's other places, obviously, but just there. Church planting is implicit in the Great Commission because one of the new disciples' first act of obedience is baptism. So great to speak to a Baptist audience. And when we baptize new believers, we don't baptize them into nothing. We baptize them into a church. So when we baptize, we are planting churches, or at least we should be. We see this most clearly with the baptism of 3,000 converts in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, the first church. And the point is, you can't be baptized without forming a local church. Yes, I know, the Ethiopian eunuch. I can talk to you about that too if you want to ask that question. Moreover, we don't merely baptize believers and trust them how to figure it out on their own, how to do church. Baptism is simply the beginning of a long process that involves more teaching. Now, it should be said that through baptism, that though baptism is the doorway into a church, the connection between what it means to be a disciple and a church member is vital. The epistles presume that being a Christian disciple means being part of a church. Now, even a cursory overview of the New Testament post-resurrection shows the missionary work of teaching is almost always centered directly on the church. Paul outlines the pattern for us in 1 Corinthians 3 and 4. Nathan talked about that. Jesse talked about that. the gospel is preached, the church is formed on top of that gospel foundation. I gave expositional talk at the Cross Missions Conference in 2021. You can check that out on the internet. It was just 1 Corinthians 3 and 4. But much, if not most, of Paul's missionary work and writings involved instructing churches over the years about living in obedience to Christ and his gospel. Missionaries, therefore, aim to plant churches that apply foundational biblical principles. And listen, brothers and sisters, there's much freedom in how churches worldwide structure the elements of fellowship. However, missionaries are not free to ignore, or worse, to oppose the clear teachings of the Bible about church practices. And furthermore, if we're to obey everything Jesus taught, we find obedience to Jesus impossible without the church. How else are we to love each other in community despite our differences, submit to our elders, practice church discipline, love each other, and show unity with each other so that the world will know that Jesus is from the disciples and is from God, and we are his disciples? John 13 through 17. This became very, very clear to me on the field when I realized the critical, rock-solid biblical teaching and practices were for the church, since the church plant may be the only church in a local population for generations. A misunderstanding of the primacy of the church and the critical need for that church to be mature can make for a lax, even wayward church plant, often called the church of the lowest common denominator. That is the church that bends biblical principles to deference to cultural context. Chris touched on this. A lack of clarity causes people to want to export. Well, a lack of clarity causes people to ask, who am I to tell people of another culture what they can or can't do? It's a weak missionary question. Or, I don't want to export Western culture. I did not include that after your question. I just want you to know I'm not talking to you directly. But you did ask the question. Anyhow, without clarity, it becomes a great temptation for missionaries to plant churches that allow cultural context to override biblical principles. And never forget, in the whole realm of contextualization, I didn't have a chance to answer this question, so I'm doing it now. In the whole realm of biblical contextualization, we don't do it perfectly. Often, we incorporate the sins of the endemic sins, unknowingly, of the local culture. So we must be very careful. We must be careful to be biblical. And besides, these questions tend to be smoke screens that come more from the liberal wing of evangelicalism that obscure obedience, or maybe from fears. I don't know. So I'll give you an example. Our church in the Arabian Peninsula, a member told me that since he came from a shame-honor culture, he couldn't practice church discipline. He had learned this from a missionary. He even swayed some younger believers to agree until they pointed out, local believers pointed out, that the church discipline is hard for any culture and that Jesus came from a shame-honor culture himself. And most importantly, it's a command of the Lord, not an idea of culture. Now, sadly, many missionaries have never seen a healthy church plant or thought much about it for that matter. So when believers arise, they're at a loss what to do. Sending churches should be aware of this and help missionaries understand the foundational principles of a church before they're sent out. Sending churches should be aware of the critical nature of planting churches with a firm biblical foundation. And yet, sending churches give a pass to unbiblical principles on the field and practices on the field they would never allow in their own churches. It comes with this phrase, a dangerous phrase, a good one. Chris used it. But in my context, you must be very careful of using that phrase. Very careful. Given the strategic nature of a field church, the long-term need for a church to nail down biblical principles and the DNA of forming a new church, biblical foundations are more important for church plants than churches in any other situation. We don't dumb down church, in other words, theologically. We hold to biblical principle. Listen, you guys, to get church planting wrong, introduces serious error in missions, especially when combined with the confusion about the gospel and gospel implications. That's where I've seen the biggest problem, is the confusion over gospel and gospel implications. And when those two errors come together, they make a powerful, though erroneous, argument to forego evangelism and discipleship by saying the aim of missions is more to be social action. Now, thankfully, that is not the biggest problem in the IMB. But I want to present to you that that is one of the biggest problems in the worldwide mission movement. So establishing an orphanage or advancing creation care is as valid as church planting. I mean, look, there's nothing wrong with orphanages. I've worked in them myself, but they are not the chief aim of a missionary. So one final concern. Missiologists, and again, this is part of my question to Jesse, which, by the way, I really appreciated Jesse's response to the idea of the core values and this cycle that we see in missions. So I'll recount those. A church sends missionaries, they evangelize, baptize, form a church, teach, obey the Great Commission to send new missionaries to plant new churches. That is undoubtedly God's plan. And my question to Jesse was, are they equally weighted? And Jesse was, no, it depends on our situation. It was an excellent answer, and actually I'm thrilled by that. It helps me. The problem, though, is when missiologists draw that chart, it appears that the parts of that cycle are equally weighted when they are not. The most important part of that cycle I present to you is a healthy church. A church is not mature because it multiplies. It multiplies because it is mature. A local, healthy, indigenous church centered on the gospel becomes self-replicating, self-sufficient, autonomous. It does not require endless cycles of missionary or untold resources to prop it up. And when the missionary leaves, they always leave. What they leave behind shapes what's next. When a church launches ministries, those ministries look like who they are. If they're unhealthy, they will plant unhealthy churches. Unhealthy churches send unhealthy missionaries who plant more unhealthy churches. It's a negative cycle of missions. And I say it because I've seen it. The church is not just one piece of the missionary calling, but the ultimate thing we do, the ultimate goal that we do, the end goal of missions is a healthy indigenous church to be the glory of Christ. Our responsibility is to make sure that we plant correctly. So, regardless of other things they may do, missionaries aim to plant indigenous churches. I do not know of a single, I've knocked all over the Middle East. I don't know of a single indigenous healthy church in the Middle East. Not one. I don't know of one. I know a number of international churches that are healthy. I'm grateful for them. And I think here's the problem. I regularly ask church planters what a church is in my Middle Eastern context, and they can't tell me, which is sad. I asked the head of a very large mission agency what a church was, and he could not tell me. This is an organization that rivals the size of the IMB. Which is sad because I can define a church in 5 tweetable sentences, or how do you say that? Exer sentences. I don't even know how to say it anymore. And I think every missionary should memorize these 3 points. Here's what a church is. A local church is a gathering of baptized, born-again Christians who covenant together in love to meet regularly under the authority of the Scriptures and ordinarily enjoy the leadership of the elders. They mutually commit to worship God, to be a visible image of the gospel, and ultimately to give God glory. I have biblical references on these. I'll go through them very quickly. No, I won't. Just ask me about it. John 3, 1 through 8, John 13, 34 through 35, Acts 2, 41, Acts 14, 23, Ephesians 3, 10, Colossians 3, 16, 2 Timothy 3, 16 through 17, and Hebrews 10, 24 through 25. That's what a church is. Here's what a church does. That was 2 sentences. A church must do only a few things to be a church. People regularly gather in gospel love to hear the word preached. They sing, they pray, they give, and practice the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper. Members build each other up in faith and faithfulness, according to 1 Corinthians 12 through 26, and guard each other's Christian lives, even if needed through the practice of church discipline, Matthew 18, 15 through 17. That's a long sentence. What is the mission of the church? So that's what church is. That's what church does. The mission of the church is God's strategic plan with one overarching mission, the Great Commission. Its mission is to go to all peoples, make disciples, and teach them to obey everything Christ has commanded, including forming new churches. That's it. I'm sorry it's so short. I guess I'd have more credibility if I had more there, but that's all we need to know. And yet, I talk to a lot of missionaries who don't know it, don't understand it. Brings me to the third point. Good leadership on the field springs from right teaching and life-on-life modeling. In other words, good leadership is taught and caught. This comes from the Seminary of Hard Knocks. I'm writing my memoir right now. I'm on chapter 7. And I told my good friend Brian that I'm writing a book called The Missionary Who Fell to Earth. And I said, basically, it's about all the mistakes I've made in ministry. And he said, as only a good friend could say, going to be a long book. It's true. Seminary of Hard Knocks. Again, the question's been asked of us, how do we identify and develop biblically qualified, competent leaders in churches we plant on the field? What has been your approach to the method to select and prepare teaching elders or pastor teachers for the churches in your ministry? It's a two-part question. And I spent some good time thinking about this question, especially the first part. How do we identify and develop? And I'm sorry that the best I could come up with was what anyone does in identifying and developing leaders anywhere in biblical churches. It's not that different. I suppose I could throw in some missiological terms, but that'd be silly. I don't need to. So identify and develop leaders according to the teachings of scriptures about what good leaders are. Good leaders are a combination of good character and right doctrine who know how to teach others. As Paul said to Timothy, watch your life and doctrine carefully. We stress and assess character by carefully matching the outline for leaders found in 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1, 1 Peter 5. Now, I would add to Don Carson's comment that his comment is that the list is not very notable, because it's the list we want for everyone. But the combination of those things, you guys, the combination of that list in 1 Timothy 3 is a pretty rare, narrow group of people. And it takes time. So in addition to character, we must make sure they've been taught, mostly to make sure they know their Bibles. This is the main thing that Jesus means when he says, teach all that Jesus or that he taught. And since, according to Jesus' words in Luke 24, all scriptures point to him, we teach the whole of scriptures. Now, I've already mentioned this before, but Paul was clear in Acts 20 that he taught the whole counsel of God, not just parts of it. And this is to guard the flock. Listen, when I was in Kenya, I met people who had practically, almost illiterate, but practically had memorized their Bible. They knew the scriptures better than I did, clearly, and I was humbled by that. And this is to guard the flock. So, two essential principles given to us by the Apostle Paul as we develop leaders. One, entrust leadership to the next generation, which is central to missionary work. Of course, we've already heard 2 Timothy 2:2. What you've heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others. Those generations. 2 Timothy 2:2 has guided my entire 45 years of ministry. It forms a significant thesis in my book, Marks of the Messenger, on how we lose the gospel in 4 generations if we don't do these parts. And I see it as a multiplication of ministry. And listen, My view is beyond a mere 4 generations. The Bible at times speaks of 10 generations. So recently I did a book review on Ray and Janie Ortland's new book. I think it's coming out next week, and my article will come out, I think, next month in review of their book. I read the manuscript. And their view is 10 generations for their family. And they calculated, I don't know how good their math is, but they calculate if families faithfully lead their children to Jesus, calling their descendants to be faithful followers of Jesus, their 4 children, if they expand in the same way, will see 55,000 people following Jesus in 10 generations in one family. How much more so in the church family, following the pattern of 2 Timothy 2:2. I believe in revival. I believe it. I came to Christ in 1972. I know that's the Paleozoic era for most of you guys, but listen, in 1972, a great revival swept across America, and Leanne and I both, my wife and I both, came to faith in 1972 as we saw many of our friends come to the Lord. There was receptivity that was not known before then to the gospel, and we understood that. But revivals come and go. And what my generation didn't do well was think about what follows, and that was the church. And I'm culpable in that, honestly. I wish I'd been more attentive to healthy church. So what follows revival matters. So you will get, Jesse and Nathan, you get no pushback from me about revival. I utterly believe it's true because you've told us. And I'm so excited about that. And I've been a part of smaller revivals, not just when I came to faith, but I saw smaller revivals happen in whole cities in Kenya. It was astonishing back in the 80s. At the same time, we have to do it slowly, this church pattern, church development. Do not be hasty in the laying on of hands, 1 Timothy 5:22. Now, there's much excitement in a 2 Timothy 2:2 ministry that easily obscures the challenges of 1 Timothy 5:22 ministry. Our aim is to establish churches that are furnaces that burn for Christ, not a brush fire that burns and then is gone. Again, with a view in ourselves of 10 generations, we want to see that kind of fruit develop. And after seeing the devastation of some churches that fell apart because he had not been bound by 2 principles of Paul, 2 Timothy 2:2, and not being hasty laying on of hands, Mark Collins in China says, in a new growing church, I didn't realize how to look beyond giftedness to see character. I also didn't realize there was a difference between good gospel urgency to reach more people and plant more churches and an unnecessary hastiness that may make things slower in the long run. So let me give you 8 things that I consider to be essential in raising indigenous leadership. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because I'm running out of time. The first step to identifying leaders is look for fat people. Faithful, available, teachable. Fat people. We want faithful, available, teachable people. And as we work with them, we want to watch them become faith people. Faithful, available, initiative takers, which is aspiring to eldership, that are teachable and holy or mature in the faith. 1 Timothy 3. Faithful, available, initiative takers that are teachable and holy. Secondly, I emphasize regularly, and we should all emphasize, we are not out for an Asian culture church or an African culture church or an American culture church. We want biblical culture church. The way to do that, it's always helpful to use biblical language. 3, We want to develop personal relationships with potential leaders, which includes knowing their family well. Generally, I would much rather have a whole family over to my house for dinner than meet up with a brother over a coffee shop or a tea room for individual conversations. Both have benefits, but knowing the family is priceless. Ask them to bring some of their friends over if they're single. 4, observe potential leaders in ministry situations, including listening to them handle the scriptures. I'm amazed how many missionaries run preaching trainings for local leaders but have yet to go and hear them preach. Even listening to a brother lead a small group study is immensely helpful in understanding how he handles the scripture. 5, extend credit but have a credit limit. You can't always expect people to prove themselves before they get opportunities to lead. You have to extend them enough credit in terms of opportunity to gain experience and show faithfulness. Give young leaders opportunity to speak and lead publicly, then watch them and extend further credit as they show themselves worthy. As much as is possible, position them for success. We want these guys to succeed. Leaders in the church should be given incremental leadership opportunities, and when they drop the ball, your job is to pick up the ball and hand it back to them. 6, we evaluate them along the way. We especially tell people when they are in the wrong. The apostles regularly urged rebuke, correction, exhortation, admonishment in the church, 2 Timothy 4. Sadly, we're slow to give these in the modern age, but often it's needed until it's too late. I want to see whether a young leader can take corrections when needed or whether their character has the humility to handle it. 7, do not fall in the trap of saying the eye does not need the hand, 1 Corinthians 12:21. You know, the book of Genesis makes it very clear that we reproduce after our own kind. It's true. But those who are developing church leaders need to be aware of that. The goal is to not make clones of yourself, but maturing disciples of Jesus. We want to see people look like Jesus. Those who are developing leadership need to be careful to see the gifts, skills, and experiences that are given to different people for the whole. Number 8, wait, don't be in a hurry. I am not persuaded that the realities of the apostolic movement in the book of Acts have much to tell us about how long it will take indigenous leaders to be ready. So again, I appreciated Jesse's comment about that it depends on our context. There are so many variables that generalizations can be unhelpful if we're not careful. I am very confident, however, that faithful men will make themselves plain in good time. There's no reason to be hasty, provided we are eager to see them flourish as God's call. Remember, generational conversion, that we'll see many people come to faith through faithful churches. Finally, leadership is taught, but it's also caught. Now, this has been gone over well. We must make sure that we understand that leadership is much as caught as is taught. Not only do we teach church leadership undergirded with rock-solid biblical foundations, but it requires modeling to be understood. It must be seen to be emulated. We must live it out in front of others and with others to counter the prevailing culture. The practical implication is that we live with the people we're developing. Leadership development is best done life on life. And again, this means those who are planting a church should be long-term participants in the church, as long as is needed for as long as God allows. I mean, Jesus did that, right? He lived with the disciples very compellingly, a holy God who left his throne, as Paul talked to us about last night from Philippians 2. Disciples lived with him daily for years. It was life-on-life discipleship. They saw how he lived, what he taught, how he died. So after the resurrection, when Jesus says the Great Commission, make disciples, they immediately have a picture of what that means from Jesus' life. I think that's Paul's example too. I was going to read these scriptures, but let me give you the references. And I think we've done this already this morning. Philippians 4:9, well, you've heard from me, 2 Timothy 3:10 through 11. You've seen my life. Follow my example, 1 Thessalonians 2:6 through 8. My experience has been that we can't form biblical leadership if we do not live with the people. In our home in Dubai, for the student movement that we started over the years, we would regularly have up to 9 people living with us. And most of those guys, and this is over time, over the 16 years that we were there, but most of them became future leaders. We lived with them. They saw our lives. They knew our kids. They saw our marriage. So very quickly, I'll give you one example of these principles outlined in the talk, how it played out in Kurdistan, our church in Kurdistan. We had 4 major people groups that were coming to church: Farsi speakers, mostly from Iran, Arab speakers, Urdu speakers from Pakistan. We had a large Pakistani population, and Kurdish speakers, which was the majority culture. And rather than being all things to all of them, we worked hard in the Erbil Baptist Church to become a healthy church. Our first focus was to be a healthy church. The service was in English. Most of those we drew in could speak some English, though some could not. But we formed language-specific home groups. We saw these groups as proto-churches. The group would review the sermon in their language, ask questions about why the church was being done the way it was, and these ranged in size. The Urdu group was up to 50, and the Kurdish group was large. The group leaders were elders in the church who spoke the language and could hand over leadership as leadership arose. This Kurdish group recently, I think maybe just 2 weeks ago, planted the only Kurdish church in our city of Erbil of 2 million people. The leaders who arose in the Urdu group were such gifted evangelists. So we had this guy who was there as a janitor in a high school, and his name was Rafakat, and he led about 30 guys to the Lord on his dorm, and we were like, dude, like this guy, forget the janitorial service. We brought him into the church staff. I started an intern program with him recently after being in the church for years and years, and 2 years of intensive training and leadership. He's recently planted a thriving, healthy church in Islamabad. I commend you to that as a model. A healthy church incubates a home group with the understanding that the group follows the model they see as church. So to develop Indigenous leaders, we need to teach a model over time as we participate in a mature church. Thank you.